of the late 18th, early 19th century. So, but first of all, I want to briefly recapitulate Kant's idea about the judgment of beauty. So I'll bring the PowerPoints up. Can you see the PowerPoint? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Good. Okay. So that's. So this is the first one is just to repeat the basic idea that we were discussing yesterday. So this is the idea of the difference between a what Kant calls a determining judgment and a judgment of taste or a judgment of beauty. I'm going to try and make this larger. Can you? That's better. So you can see that when we're making a determining judgment, we have an object in front of us, and it has certain properties. So here I've, just as an illustration, I've put a picture of a cube of sugar. So you can see that the cube of sugar has certain properties. It's a cube, it's white, it's sweet, and so forth. So we can determine what the object is by applying certain predicates to it, or concepts like cubic, white, sweet. These are universals. Concepts are universals because that they apply to many different things. They apply to many different particulars. Yeah. So that's what Kant means by a determining judgment, which is the normal kind of judgment we use in everyday life when we're identifying objects or describing objects. So the reflective aesthetic judgment is different from that. So as you can see, we see a flower, and we say that the flower is beautiful. But my way of trying to illustrate what Kant is saying is to put the concept beautiful between the subject and the object. So as we discussed yesterday, Kant does not think that that beauty is a property of the flower in the way that being white or being sweet is a property of the cube of sugar. And I think we can think of the property as being somewhere between the subject and the object. It seems as though we're attributing the property to the object when we say that it's beautiful. It seems that the statement or the judgment has the same structure as the statement about the cube of sugar. But in fact, Kant thinks it has a different structure because beauty is not a property of the object. Beauty describes the interaction between the object and the subject. So that's one important aspect of the reflective aesthetic judgment. We can also say that the object is the occasion for my judgment. I have the flower in front of me, and I say the flower is beautiful, but my judgment is free. I'm not forced to say that the flower is beautiful simply by the objective nature of the world in front of me. I don't have to say that. I might disagree. For some reason, I might not like flowers. So I'm not obliged or I'm not forced to say that the flower is beautiful. It's a free judgment. So, and we can also say that in a certain sense, the process of judgment is the aesthetic pleasure. So the point there is, it's not that I have a distinctive feeling or a distinctive sensation, and then that feeling tells me that the object is beautiful. My very process of judging and saying this is a beautiful thing, this is a beautiful object, this is a beautiful flower, or whatever, that very process in a way is the aesthetic pleasure, the process of judging, because it involves the interplay of the imagination and the understanding, concepts and sensory experience in the way that we were discussing yesterday. So I hope that makes it clearer. Someone asked a question. Yeah, in a way, that's right. When we say something is beautiful, we're saying something more about ourselves than we are about the object. Well, actually, I wouldn't completely agree with that. I want to say it's between ourselves and the object. So it's not simply in me, because not everything is beautiful, but it's not in the object either. It's in the interplay between the subject and the object. Yeah? But when we say something is beautiful, we are saying something about our response. We are saying something about our response to the object. Now I have to get back to the PowerPoints. Oh, here we are. Okay. Sorry, I had a problem there. Okay, so can you see the PowerPoints again?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. No? I don't know what's happening here. Okay, feedback.
Gente, aconteceu algum problema? Professor, o senhor está com o microfone desligado.
Yeah. Oh, I have to present now. Yeah. I think it should be okay now. Can you see the PowerPoints now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good. Sorry about the technical problem. Okay, so I now want to talk about the relation between Kant and Shelling. So this will be quite complicated. So this PowerPoint is a kind of preview of the relationship, and then I will speak in much more detail about the arguments. So this is just to give you a preview of what we will be discussing for the first part of the class. So in Kant, we have, as I said yesterday, the fundamental problem which he is thinking about in the Critique of Judgment is the relation between nature and human consciousness and human freedom. And this is obviously a central problem in modern philosophy, because nature seems to be structured by causal relations of cause and effect, which are necessary relations, and it's difficult to find a place for human freedom in that picture of nature. And this is it's a central problem for modern philosophy in general, and it's also a central problem for Kant. So he has nature on the one side, which is objective and dominated by causality, and then we have human consciousness, human subjectivity, and we experience ourselves as agents, as free beings who are free, who can choose what to do, who can think and be responsible for what they think. So we have a kind of freedom which does not easily fit with our picture of nature. And in the Critique of Judgment, Kant is thinking about this problem. And as we discussed yesterday, beauty is a kind of point of convergence between the object and the subject. You can see that from what I just said, that beauty is somehow between the subject and the object. So when we experience nature as beautiful, it seems that nature is suitable or adapted for our way of knowing, for our form of knowing nature. So beauty suggests that there is a fundamental compatibility between human beings and nature. I think that's the idea that Kant has, despite the fact that, metaphysically speaking, in terms of metaphysics, causality and freedom seem to be opposed to each other. In experience of beauty, we have a compatibility between human freedom and nature. But Kant does not think that we can make a metaphysical statement or a metaphysical claim that nature is purposive. In other words, that nature is designed to support human freedom. That would be a metaphysical claim which Kant thinks we are not able to make. That goes further than our experience. It goes further than what it is possible for us to say and to justify. So one of the big differences between Kant and the German idealist philosophers who came after him is that they reject that limitation. They reject Kant's argument that we cannot say anything about the metaphysical structure of the world. So at the bottom of this PowerPoint, you have a diagram of how Shelling thinks about this relationship in the period of his identity philosophy. So this is a period from around 1800 or 1801 to around 1806. For about 5 years at the beginning of the 19th century, Shelling proposed what he called an identity philosophy. So what that means is that metaphysically, from a metaphysical point of view, the subject and the object are identical. In the empirical world, or in the world as we experience it, the subject and the object are separate, but that's just how we experience things in the empirical world. And what this means is that there is nothing which is purely objective, and there is nothing which is purely subjective. Everything is a mixture of the objective and the subjective. So Shelling thinks that nature has a kind of subjectivity. We can see that most obviously in the case of living entities, organisms, or animals. It seems quite plausible to say that animals have a kind of subjectivity, even though that subjectivity is less developed than human subjectivity. And similarly, although we are experiencing subjects, we are also natural beings. We are also part of nature. So on the metaphysical picture that Shelling puts forward, we have different combinations of the subjective and the objective. But there is always a mixture of the subjective and the objective in every part of reality. What we can say is that in the human subject, the subjectivity is dominant over objectivity, and in nature, objectivity is dominant over subjectivity. But in everything, there is a mixture of objectivity and subjectivity. So that's the metaphysical picture which Shelling is putting forward at this period. Okay, so now I want to talk in more detail about how he criticizes Kant. So, as I said yesterday, only the first half of the Critique of Judgment is concerned with aesthetic judgment, nature, the beauty of nature and the beauty of works of art. The second half of the book is about what Kant calls teleological judgment. So teleology is the idea that something is organized in terms of its purpose or in terms of its end. So teleology is the opposite of mechanical causality. And as I said a moment ago, natural organisms seem to be an obvious example of entities which are organized teleologically. So Kant is interested in this because it suggests that there is a kind of purpose in nature, or the notion of purpose does have a function in nature. But he makes the same argument that he makes in the case of art. In other words, he wants to say that when we judge something as an organism which is teleologically structured, that's a reflective judgment, when it's not a determining judgment. In other words, we have to think of certain things that we experience in the world as teleologically structured, but that's just the way we think about them, and it may be necessary to think about them in that way, even in order to carry out scientific research, for example. But that's not a determining judgment, it's only a reflective judgment. So again, Kant is holding back from making a metaphysical claim about purpose or about teleology. I mean, just to make this this clear, an organism, a living organism, in a living organism, all the parts seem to collaborate. The different individual organisms or the different parts of the animal collaborate, work together to sustain the life of the animal. So we have a situation in which the totality seems to precede the parts. The totality is what determines the function of the parts. So this is the reverse of mechanical causality, where we start with the parts and we explain the totality in terms of the interaction of the parts. Here, it seems we need the concept of the organism as a whole in order to explain the function of the different organs. For example, in a human being, the function of the heart, the function of the lungs, the function of the liver, the function of the stomach, and so forth. These all have a function in terms of the overall life of the organism. And this is the teleological structure of the organism. So the problem for Shelling is that Kant does not want to say that teleology is real, if I can put it like that the organism really is structured in terms of its purpose, which is sustaining its own existence. Shelling does not think it's possible to avoid making a metaphysical claim about teleology. So this is the quotation at the bottom of this PowerPoint. So Shelling was born in 1775, so he began very young as a philosopher. He started publishing when he was 19 or 20 years old. He was a kind of prodigy as a philosopher. So in 1797, he published his first book on the philosophy of nature, called Ideas for a Philosophy of Nature. And in that book, he criticizes Kant, and in the following way. he says, if it rests on your choice whether or not to impose the idea of purposiveness on things outside you, how does it come about that you impose this idea only on certain things and not on all? And that further, in this representing of purposeful products, you feel yourself in no way free, but absolutely constrained. You could give no other reason either than this purposive form belongs to certain things outside you originally and without assistance from your choice. So what he's really saying there is, if you think that the organism is teleologically structured, that is because it really is teleologically structured. This is in Kantian terms, this is a determining judgment, and it's not just a reflective judgment, which you can use to guide your investigations, but does not entitle you to make a metaphysical claim. So that's the difference between Shelling and Kant on the question of teleology. So at the top of that PowerPoint, you can see Kant trying to, well, in English we say sit on the fence. That means you try to avoid making a decision one way or the other. So he says, Kant says, the concept of a thing as a natural end, that's his word for an organism, a natural end, is transcendent for determining judgment if its object is viewed by reason. What he means is that lies beyond anything that you can say in a determining judgment. Transcendent means it goes beyond anything you can say. Although for reflective judgment, it may be immanent in respect of objects of experience. So that's Kant using his technical language, but what he's really saying is, you're not entitled to make a determining judgment that the organism is teleologically structured, but within your experience, it seems as though it really is. I mean, maybe your pet dog or your pet cat really seems to be living its own life and to be all the parts of its body are cooperating in sustaining its life. It's not just a machine. And that's how we experience the animal. But the difference is that Kant thinks that is only that's a reflective judgment, not a determining judgment. Whereas for Shelling, this is a determining judgment about the reality of teleology. So for these thinkers, there is a very close connection between organisms and works of art, that the integration of a work of art is very similar to the integration of an organism, in which all the parts collaborate in order to produce the overall effect. So I now want to talk about an important book which Shelling published in 1800, which is called the System of Transcendental Idealism. This book is very important for many reasons. It develops a kind of history of the evolution of human consciousness, which influenced Hegel when he wrote his Phenomenology of Spirit. But from our point of view, the important aspect of the book is that art solves a philosophical problem at the end of the book. The last part of the book is about art and the function of art as a revelation of metaphysical truth. So, as I've just been explaining, from 1797 onwards, Shelling developed a philosophy of nature, and this was opposed to the philosophy of Kant and Fichte. Fichte was a important follower of Kant who also adopted the standpoint of the Kantian method of transcendental philosophy, which means that nature has no ontological independence, but is dependent on the subject, the constituting subject. But as we've just seen in his philosophy of nature, Shelling thinks that nature really is independent. It's ontologically independent. It exists in its own right, and it has its own teleological organization. But at this stage in his philosophical thinking, Shelling, he doesn't abandon the other approach to philosophy, which begins with the experiencing subject. That's the transcendental philosophy of Kant. He tries to do both at once. So he has a philosophy of nature, but he also has a transcendental philosophy. And in the introduction to the system of transcendental idealism, he says that there are two fundamental sciences. There's a philosophy of nature, which treats nature as ontologically independent in terms of its being. But there is also transcendental philosophy, which begins from the experiencing subject. And we can explain the world in either way. We can begin from the experiencing subject and explain how our experience of the world is constructed, or we can begin from nature and we can explain how the forms of nature develop. So we have two ways of approaching the world philosophically. And in the system of transcendental idealism, he's developing the Kantian approach, the approach which begins with human subjectivity and which begins with human experience. But this poses a problem, because from the other standpoint, from the natural standpoint, the whole of reality unfolds with necessity. So he's really encountering the problem that Kant had already encountered about the relation between freedom and necessity, or about the relation between freedom and natural causality. From our standpoint, from the standpoint of the human subject, what happens in history in particular is a result of free human agency. But if we look at the world from the standpoint of nature, everything unfolds necessarily. So Shelling finds this problem of the relation between freedom and necessity returning again when he thinks about human history. And this is a familiar problem in the philosophy of history. Is there some kind of pattern in history, which means that history unfolds in a necessary way, or is history just the result of free human action without any pattern? This is or without any system. This is what he's trying to think about. So at the end of the system of transcendental idealism, art becomes the answer to the philosophical problem of the relation between freedom and necessity. Art plays a fundamental role at the end of the system of transcendental idealism, because art offers us an experience of the reconciliation of freedom and necessity. But the important point about Schelling's argument in this book is that art does something which philosophy cannot do. So there is a sense in which art is superior to philosophy. We could, the philosopher cannot explain how freedom and necessity can be reconciled, or how they can be integrated. That's something that philosophy cannot explain. But in the experience of art, we have an actual experience of that reconciliation. So although we can't understand it philosophically, we can experience its reality. So this is why Shelling argues that art is superior to philosophy in providing this final solution to the problem. So why does he argue that, or how does he argue that? Well, he's building on Kant's theory of artistic genius. So this is something we discussed briefly yesterday, but we didn't talk about it very much. But we did talk about the fact that beauty is not a attribute of the object. It's not, as we saw at the beginning today. So there can't be any rules or instructions for how to make a work of art. If you could follow a set of instructions to make a work of art, then there would be certain concepts which would apply, and those concepts would tell you that you had made a work of art. But we know that's not the case. Beauty can't be produced by following a set of rules. And this means that the artist, the creative artist, must have something which Kant calls genius, which is the ability to create beauty without following rules. So this is what Kant says in paragraph 46 of the Critique of Judgment. He says, genius is the talent or the natural endowment which gives the rule to art. Since talent, as an innate productive faculty of the artist, belongs itself to nature, we may put it this way: genius is the innate mental aptitude through which nature gives the rule to art. So ingenium, I think etymologically that means something like something that you are born with. You are just born with this capacity to make art. It's something that only certain special people have, certain talented people have. But the artist cannot make a work of art consciously, or not purely consciously, because if the artist made the work of art consciously, they would simply be following rules or following a procedure. So there is something natural, something spontaneous, something unconscious about the way in which the artist makes a work of art. So genius is a talent for producing that for which no definite rule can be given. That's what Kant argues. So the creative artist cannot know exactly what she is producing. There is creativity in art is a combination of conscious and unconscious activity. This is which for Shelling means it's a combination of freedom and necessity. So this is why he thinks that the work of art provides the solution to his philosophical problem, because in genius, in the creation of art, we experience the fusion, the integration of freedom and necessity, or the conscious and the unconscious. So this is what Shelling says at the end of the system of transcendental idealism. It can only be the contradiction between conscious and unconscious in the free act which sets the artistic urge in motion. Just as conversely, it can be given to art alone to pacify our endless striving, and likewise to solve the final contradiction within us. Just as aesthetic production proceeds from the feeling of a seemingly irresoluble contradiction, so it ends likewise in the feeling of an infinite harmony. So there is this contradiction between the conscious and the unconscious, or there's a conscious. We experience the contradiction between freedom and necessity in our own lives, because very often we attempt to do things, but the natural world and the causal patterns of the natural world go against what we are trying to do, or go against what we are trying to achieve, or the end that we are trying to realize. So we are all aware of this contradiction between freedom and necessity. The artist creates an object, the art object, which reconciles that contradiction. And so when we experience the work of art, we experience the resolution of that contradiction, so, which Shelling calls a feeling of infinite harmony. So he then says, just as the artist is driven into production involuntarily, so likewise is his production endowed with objectivity, as if by no help of his own, that is purely in an objective manner. So there he's describing the sort of spontaneous, unconscious way in which the artist creates the work of art. It's not something which is done deliberately, consciously, by following rules, as I've said several times already. And then Shelling says that what the artwork presents is an infinite, finitely displayed, but the infinite, finitely displayed is beauty. The basic feature of every work of art is therefore beauty. So here we have a different definition, or we could what looks like a different definition of beauty from the Kantian definition, because it's the infinite, finitely displayed. It's like a paradox. It's a paradox. How can you display the finite in the infinite? How can you display the infinite in the finite? It seems paradoxical, but this is what Shelling thinks is achieved by the work of art. And this is what beauty is. Beauty is this fusion, unity of the infinite and the finite. So that's the first important point. The second important point goes back to what I said at the beginning yesterday, that so the work of art is giving us a kind of metaphysical knowledge. So again, this is different from Kant. It's for Shelling, the experience of the work of art is not about a kind of pleasure that we experience in judgment. We are actually obtaining a metaphysical insight, a metaphysical knowledge in our experience of the work of art, and this will be very important also for Hegel. Hegel will also develop a very similar argument that the work of art provides us with a kind of metaphysical knowledge. So in the second half of the lecture, I want to talk about the lectures on art, which Shelling gave in 1802, 1803, in which he develops this position in much more detail. But I think we should have a discussion now, if any of you want to ask any questions. So does anyone have a question about what I've said so far? No. Yeah. Okay. Someone asked a question about the Javan asked a question about the relation between freedom and necessity in human history. So Schelling, he thinks there is a pattern. He thinks there's a pattern in human history. He thinks that that history evolves, and that it evolves towards the idea of a constitutional state. So we start with a situation in which societies are run in a authoritarian way by a king or a dictator or a ruler, and gradually in the course of history freedom becomes more and more important, and we move towards a situation in which society is ruled by law, and the law applies equally to everybody. And he thinks that eventually we will have a kind of world society, that different societies will stop fighting wars against each other, and there will be a kind of peaceful world society. So he has a whole narrative of how human history will develop, from a primitive state which is very violent and authoritarian, to a state in which societies are ruled by law, and then in which even international law becomes possible. So there is international law which governs the relation between states. Of course, we haven't reached that situation yet, but so he has a whole pattern of history. The problem is, if from the standpoint of freedom, that pattern is very important. It's very important to think that freedom is becoming more predominant, that societies are becoming more lawful, that human freedom is increasing. But at the same time, if you say that there's a pattern, if you say that there's a system in history and that we can describe the necessary way in which history develops, that seems to contradict the idea of freedom. So on the one hand, we need the pattern because we need to think that history is moving towards more and more freedom, but that pattern seems to contradict the very fact that there is a pattern or in history seems to contradict the idea of freedom. So that's the problem. Does that help to make it clearer? Yeah. Okay. The second question is about, is there a space for the ugly or grotesque aesthetic in Shelling? He doesn't talk about the ugly or the grotesque. He's very much centered on the idea of beauty as the unity of the finite and the finite and the infinite. I think he might say that you can portray, say, ugly things in painting or poetry, but that portrayal would itself be beautiful. You could have a beautiful painting of an ugly thing, but the painting itself could not be ugly, because if it were ugly, it would not be an expression of this unity of the finite and the infinite. So Maria has asked a question about the academic art was developing this period. So there were rules which were being followed by artists. So that raises an interesting question. I think the concept of genius does not mean that there are no rules for making works of art, no rules at all. It just means that following the rules will not produce a work of art. So in the Critique of Judgment, Kant says that sometimes he talks as though genius is a kind of rather wild natural capacity which needs to be controlled and which needs to be limited. So that's the way in which Kant thinks about it. You need the genius, but you also need the rules in order to channel the genius or control the genius in order to produce the work of art. So it's a kind of collaboration between the spontaneity of genius and the rules of art. But the point is that you can't make a work of art simply by following rules. Yeah. But of course, when art becomes academic, that's precisely what happens. When art becomes academic, then it means that the rules become too important. People are dominated by the rules. And when you are dominated by the rules, then you cease to make interesting or meaningful works of art. Yeah. So it doesn't go against the concept of art. It has the technique has to be complemented by genius. Even a great artist has to master the technique of how to make the work of art. But the technique is not the complete story. As we will see on Friday, maybe tomorrow as well. This is also very important for Adorno and for Hegel. For Adorno, the relation between technique on the one hand and what he calls expression on the other, or mimesis or expression. That we need the technique, but the technique will not produce a work of art on its own. Okay, so Guilherme has got a question about when he does not give way on transcendental idealism. So does the Kantian transcendental dualism remain in his system? This is just a brief stage in Schelling's thinking. For a period around 1800, he believed that it was possible to have a transcendental system like Kant, but also a philosophy of nature. He believed it was possible to have both. So, as I said earlier on today, he argues that there are two fundamental sciences. He calls them Grundwissenschaft, he says, is the German word he uses. There are two fundamental sciences, and it's as if we can look at the world philosophically from two different perspectives, but they will produce the same result. But in one way, we begin from nature and we arrive at human subjectivity, and in the other way, we begin with human subjectivity and we construct nature. So another way of thinking about what Schelling is saying is that human beings obviously emerge out of nature. We come out of nature, we evolve out of nature. So there's a sense, an obvious sense in which nature comes before human beings, and we are within nature. So this is the perspective of his philosophy of nature, that human beings and human subjectivity emerges out of nature. And that's possible because even below the level of human beings, in the organic world, we already have subjectivity. It's a more primitive kind of subjectivity than human subjectivity, but we already have subjectivity. So human subjectivity is a development of that subjectivity which is already in nature. So that would be the naturphilosophisch, the standpoint of the philosophy of nature. And that's very different from Kant and also Fichte, who follows after Kant, who try to construct the whole world of that we experience, the whole natural world, by analyzing human consciousness. So those are the two opposite approaches. At this stage, Schelling thinks you can do both, but as we'll see after the break, this phase of his thinking does not last for very long because it's too unstable. He wants to argue that we can have these two different philosophical sciences, but it's very difficult to explain how they fit together. How can you begin from the subject on the one hand, but begin from nature on the other hand? It seems that you have to begin from one or the other. So this is not a stable solution. And as we'll see, the notion of art as the solution of a philosophical problem is also not stable, but it's very important because throughout modern philosophy, there is a debate about the relation between the knowledge which art gives us and the knowledge that philosophy gives us. And as we'll see tomorrow, this is really important for Hegel. Hegel is very, very concerned, very preoccupied with this question about what is the knowledge which we obtain from works of art, from the experience of art, and what is the knowledge which we obtain from philosophy, and what's the relation between the two. This becomes a very important problem. But one thing that you need to remember is that this whole argument is presupposes that art does give us a kind of metaphysical knowledge. So that was the first point that I made yesterday, that this tradition is quite special because many philosophers, many aestheticians, many writers about art would consider this to be much too strong. The claim is much too strong that there is a kind of metaphysical knowledge which is provided by art. But this is the distinctive aspect of this idealist tradition. Okay. Okay, so I suggest we have a break for about 30 minutes at this point. So let's meet again at 20 minutes to, it'll be 20 minutes to 4 your time, is that right? Yeah. We'll meet again at 20 minutes to 4, and I will talk about the lectures on the philosophy of art, which Shelling gave in 1802, 1803. Okay, so I'll see you in half an hour. things I need to say about the end of the system of transcendental idealism. So this is how Shelling discusses the relation between philosophy and art at the end of the system of transcendental idealism. He says that if aesthetic intuition is merely transcendental intuition become objective, it is self-evident that art is at once the only true and eternal organ and document of philosophy, which ever and again continues to speak to us of what philosophy cannot depict in external form, namely the unconscious element in acting and producing and its original identity with the conscious. So so he's saying there that, as you can see, that art is the organ and document of philosophy. In other words, art enables us to know what philosophy is trying to explain. So when he talks at the beginning of that quotation about the transcendental intuition, he means the pure self-consciousness, or what Kant called the transcendental unity of apperception. So that means simply our awareness of ourselves as subjects of experience, as experiencing subjects. That's obviously something subjective, internal to our consciousness. And for Shelling, we already have the identity of subject and object in that transcendental intuition, because in self-consciousness, what is conscious and what is the object of consciousness are the same. This is a fundamental insight, or a fundamental point of the German idealists, that human self-consciousness is already the identity of subject and object, because we are aware of ourselves. What we are aware of is the same as the subject of the awareness, of the consciousness. So, but the problem is, how do we make that identity of subject and object external, something that is actually available to experience? And this is why he thinks that art is the way in which we can experience that unity of the subject and the object. So it gives us what philosophy cannot depict in external form, and it's the original unity of the conscious and it gives us the original unity of the conscious and the unconscious. So he's raising the question of the relation between the truth revealed by art and the truth articulated by philosophy, which is a permanent problem for idealist aesthetics. What is the relation between the two kinds of truth? Are they in fact the two? Are they in fact the same kind of truth, or is it the same truth which is being expressed in two different forms, two different ways, through the work of art and through philosophical reflection? And the point here is that art is superior to philosophy, or art can do something which philosophy cannot do. So earlier on, I talked about Schelling's identity philosophy. So this is the position that Shelling moves to very soon after the system of transcendental idealism. So the system of transcendental idealism was published in 1800, and by 1801 which is 1 year later, he'd already moved to the position of identity philosophy. So he's no longer has a dualism of Naturphilosophy, philosophy of nature, and Transcendental philosophy. That dualism is unstable, as I said before the break, because we don't know, do we start with nature or do we start with the subject? Does the subject come out of nature, or is nature constructed in the experience of the subject? In Schelling's new system, we have the absolute identity of subject and object. The ideal and the real divides into two basic dimensions, mind and nature, but nothing in the empirical world is purely subjective or purely objective, as I said earlier on. For those of you who are familiar with the history of philosophy, this position is very like Spinoza. So Schelling is very influenced by Spinoza at this point. He's very inspired by Spinoza because, as you know, Spinoza has a single basic principle, which he calls substance, which is a single unitary principle, but substance has different attributes, and one of these is thought and one of these is extension. So thinking and sort of matter extended in space are just two different dimensions of, or attributes of, the one single substance in Spinoza's metaphysics. And Schelling has a very similar idea in his identity philosophy. He doesn't call it substance, he calls it absolute identity. And absolute identity divides into a subjective world where the subject is predominant over the object, and an objective world in which the object is predominant over the subject. So that's very similar to Spinoza's division between the attribute of extension and the attribute of thinking. And it's an attempt to deal with a fundamental problem in modern philosophy, which is, what is the relation between mind and nature, or what is the relation between subjectivity and nature? If you divide them, then and give them different metaphysical foundations, then you have a permanent problem of how the mind and the natural world interrelate. So the notion of substance in Spinoza, or the notion of absolute identity, is a way of dealing with that problem by saying there is a single principle which then divides into two dimensions or into two attributes. And the identity philosophy provides the framework for the philosophy of art that Schelling develops in his lectures. So Schelling never published these lectures during his lifetime, but they were influential. They were passed around. The manuscript of or a transcript of these lectures made by students was passed around, so many people knew about them. Hegel was actually, who was a friend of Schelling, that they were working together at the University of Jena at this time, at the beginning of the 19th century. So Hegel also knew about Schelling's philosophy, lectures on the philosophy of art, and he does refer to Schelling in his own lectures on the philosophy of art. So, in the lectures on the philosophy of art, Schelling says that art is the perfect forming into unity. The German word he uses is in Einheitsbildung, for those of you who know German. So that means something like forming into a unity or forming into one of the real and the ideal in the dimension of the real. And philosophy is the forming into unity, the Ineinsbildung of the real and the ideal in the dimension of the ideal. So we saw before the break that that Schelling talks about art in the system of transcendental idealism as the infinite being revealed in the finite. This is a similar idea, that in art the ideal and the real are united, they are fused together, but in the dimension of the real. So in other words, not in thought like in philosophy. In philosophy, we can think about absolute identity, but that absolute identity is also revealed to us in works of art. So that's the difference between the system of transcendental idealism and the lectures on the philosophy of art. In the system, as we saw, Schelling thinks art is in a way superior to philosophy. It can give us this insight which philosophy can't achieve. But by the time he reaches the lectures, he thinks that philosophy and art can do the same thing, but art achieves this unity in the real, in experience, in outward experience, whereas philosophy achieves this unity in the ideal, in other words, in thought, in thinking. But the ideal is a higher potentiality of the absolute than the real. So Schelling says, insofar as the ideal is always a higher reflex of the real, reflection of the real, in other words, the philosopher necessarily possesses an even higher ideal reflex of that which in the artist is real. So philosophy of art in the larger sense is the presentation of the absolute world in the form of art. So there you have a technical word that Schelling uses throughout his philosophy, which is the word potence, which is, it's hard to translate. Because it can mean something like a power in the mathematical sense, but it also has the implication of potentiality. So when Schelling is talking about these different levels of reality, he describes them as different potenzen, different potentialities. In other words, different ways in which the real and the ideal, or the subjective and the objective, can be combined. But now he is saying that philosophy can actually understand art and reflect upon art and theorize art as a unity of the real and the ideal. So philosophy can, his technical word is construct. So philosophy can construct the system of art, and it can show how in not just individual works of art, but in the whole system of different kinds of art, we have a overall presentation of the world in its different levels of reality. So it's a very ambitious metaphysical approach to the status of art. Okay, so this is the system of the arts which Shelling constructs in his lectures on the philosophy of art. So everything, the way in which the system works is that everything is divided into a real side and an ideal side. In other words, an objective side and a subjective side. But then you can have a subjective side within the objective side, and you can have an objective side within the subjective side, and then you can divide again, so that you have these constantly more refined, complex relations between the subjective and the objective. So the fundamental distinction that he makes is between bildende Kunst. So again, that's quite difficult to translate into English, but we can call this formative art. So he means arts which actually use material. They use some kind of material, whether it's paint or it's the sound produced by physical objects, or a kind of stone or metal if we're making a sculpture. It uses a material and it shapes or forms the material into the work of art. So that's why bildende Kunst is on the real side. It's part of the real series of art. The ideal is formed into the real, and the infinite into the finite, and the universal into the particular. Those are the features of formative art, which is on the real side. On the ideal side, we have verbal art. So this is essentially poetry. So the point about verbal art or poetry is that we're dealing just with ideas. The ideas expressed in language. So there isn't a material substance which is being shaped or manipulated in order to create the work of art. The work of art is created simply in the imagination or simply in the mind by using language. So this is why he thinks that poetry, verbal art belongs to the ideal series, and in this series the real is formed into the ideal, because we use language to describe the world, to describe human actions, to describe situations. The finite is transformed into the infinite because we're using concepts which are not something material and limited, and the particular is informed into the universal. So that's his fundamental distinction between formative art on the one hand and verbal art on the other. So you have to remember that all of art is on the real side, but even on the real side of, there is this distinction between formative art and verbal art. Verbal art is still on the real side of the world because it presents situations, human actions, objects, but it does so through language. But it's still not working with pure concepts. It's presenting us with images of things through language. So within this basic division between formative art and verbal art, we then have further subdivisions. So Shelling distinguishes between music, painting, and architecture and sculpture. And the argument he wants to make is that we have a real potentiality, potence, we have an ideal potentiality or level of reality, and then we have what he calls indifference. So indifference is like identity expressed at a particular level. So the real potence is music. So in music, we have to use physical objects, and we strike them, or we use a bow if we're playing a violin in order to make the strings vibrate. But we make the object vibrate in some way or other, and it produces sound. So it's a physical process, and which makes the sound come out of the object. And then the music is produced by shaping the sounds which are produced by the objects. So this is why Shelling thinks that music is the real potence at the level of formative art. On the ideal side of formative art, we have painting. And this is because in painting, we represent objects on a two-dimensional surface using light and color. So already we're moving away from materiality. It's no longer the direct materiality of the musical instruments which are being struck or bowed, or we blow into some instruments like trumpets and so forth to make them vibrate, but we're representing the physical world in the form of by using paint and color and line. So that's the ideal potence at the level of formative art. And the indifference, the unity of the real and the ideal is found in architecture and sculpture, because architecture and sculpture they're in a material form, but they are presenting something ideal. So Shelling famously says that architecture is frozen music. This is one of the most famous statements he makes in the philosophy of art, that architecture is frozen music. In other words, music which is no longer moving, but has been stabilized. On the verbal side, which is on the ideal side, he thinks that the real potence, the real potentiality, is lyric poetry. And I found this quite hard to understand myself, because you might think, well, lyric poetry, which is a kind of spontaneous expression of the feelings of an individual, you might think that that's something ideal rather than something real. But I think what Shelling has in mind is the idea that this is a kind of natural, spontaneous expression. it's a direct, natural expression of a human being, and that's why he puts it on the real side. Whereas on the ideal side, he has epic poetry, which again is an idealized portrayal of heroes and adventures and actions. But it's, as he says, the poet does not appear in the epic poem. Virgil does not appear in the Aeneid. Virgil is like the omnipotent narrator who is telling the story, but Virgil is not appearing and expressing himself directly in the epic poem. And again, we have a moment of indifference, which is the unity of the real and the ideal. And this, Shelling says, we find in drama, because in drama we have characters in the drama who are directly expressing themselves as the lyric poet expresses himself, but they are characters engaged in an action, engaged in a story, which we can observe objectively. So that's why he thinks that drama is the unity. By indifference, he means something like the unity of the two preceding forms of art. The unity of the lyric and the epic is drama, and architecture and sculpture are the unity of music and painting. So at the bottom there, I've put allegorical, schematic, and symbolic, because this is Schelling's way of categorizing these different forms of art. So I'll show you, this is on the next slide. So this is how Shelling defines allegorical, schematic, and symbolic art. That representation in which the universal means the particular, or in which the particular is intuited through the universal, is schematism. That representation in which the particular means the universal, or in which the universal is intuited through the particular, is allegory. And then we have, again, we always have a synthesis, the synthesis of the two, where neither the universal means the particular, nor the particular the universal, but where both are absolute one, is the symbolic. So that's the categorization that he gives at the bottom of this PowerPoint of the different kinds of art. That music is allegorical because it's pointing towards the ideal, and painting is schematic because it's pointing towards the particular, and architecture and sculpture are symbolic because they unite the two. And similarly with lyric poetry, epic poetry, and drama. So that's the way in which Shelling describes the system of the arts in his philosophy of art. One of the big differences between Shelling and Hegel is that this is this system does not really have a historical dimension. It's a kind of static system of different kinds of art. Shelling does make lots of remarks about the changes in human consciousness over time. This is something that all the German idealists were very interested in, the way in which human consciousness evolves over time. But and we can see art as a document of the development of human consciousness, that that is the way in which Hegel understands art, as we will see tomorrow. In the history of art, we can see the history of the development of human consciousness. But Hegel tries to integrate the historical dimension into his theory, whereas Schelling does not really integrate the historical dimension into his theory. Okay, so I want to conclude by looking at some of the questions which are raised by Schelling's philosophy of art, and which, as we will see tomorrow, they become very important for Hegel. All these questions which Schelling's theory raises. So, what's the relation between individual arts, such as music, painting, poetry, and historical forms of art? So we can distinguish between individual arts like music, painting, and poetry. We can distinguish genres within a particular art, like landscape painting, portrait painting in painting, or tragedy and comedy in drama. And we can also distinguish what Hegel calls forms of art. So Hegel has a specific theory of forms of art, which are arranged historically, as we'll see tomorrow. One of which is classical art, which is the art primarily of ancient Greece, and romantic art, which is the art of the, it's a big category, it's the art of the Middle Ages and the art of the modern world. And we could imagine an evolution between the individual arts which followed the evolution of the forms of art. That sounds quite complicated, but it will become clearer tomorrow. So the way in which Hegel understands that evolution is that the arts gradually become more ideal. We can see that Schelling has this idea that we have more real arts and more ideal arts. We could tell a story in which art is moving from the material or the real towards the ideal. And in fact, Schelling does suggest that at one point. He says we could think of matter gradually dematerializing into the ideal. So first of all, you would have matter, sculpture, then you would have painting as the relative ideal through light, which uses light. Then you would have music coming after painting, and then after music you would have speech and poetry, which, as we saw, is purely ideal. So this is interesting because, in fact, Schelling is here anticipating the kind of story that Hegel tells in his aesthetics. Hegel begins with sculpture and architecture, which is the most material, and then he moves through painting, and then to music, and then to poetry. So there's a dynamic of idealization which is running through the history of art. So Schelling he has this thought at one point, but he doesn't really follow it, and it doesn't really fit with his basic system. But we can also say that the transition from the real towards the ideal is mirrored in the historical transition from ancient polytheism, where the gods are within nature. You know, the gods are portrayed as being like human beings, and they intervene in the epic stories of the Iliad and the Aeneid and the Odyssey. So there's a transition from this ancient polytheism to Christianity. So we could align that development in the history of art with this development of religious consciousness. moving towards the ideal. And in fact, this is what Hegel does in his philosophy of art. So Shelling does talk about ancient and modern art. So this was a very common theme in discussions of the arts, the relation between ancient art and modern or Christian art. But he doesn't integrate this this dimension of the discussion, the historical dimension, into his discussion. Hegel does integrate that dimension, but this produces other kinds of problems. So there we have this whole question of the relation between individual arts and historical forms of art. Okay, what's the relation between the knowledge contained in art and philosophical knowledge? So art gives us an experience of the indifference of the finite and the infinite as indifference. So art gives us access to the absolute. And in the system of transcendental idealism, this was an access which philosophy could not provide. But in Schelling's identity system, philosophical reason can articulate the absolute. So philosophy is no longer dependent upon art in order to achieve a final insight into the nature of the absolute or metaphysical reality. So we can then ask, well, what is the special cognitive role of art if philosophy can also achieve this insight? So we have the problem of the relation between art and philosophical knowledge. And finally, this is a very important question. Can there be a modern mythology? So you might ask yourself the question, well, why do we need a modern mythology? Or why would we need a modern mythology? So in his lectures, Schelling talks about the form of art, and he also talks about the content of art. So as we know already, the German idealists had an aesthetics which was not simply formalist, but very much focused on the content of art. And he says that in the ancient world, Schelling says that in the ancient world, mythology is the condition and content of art. Why is that? Well, that's because the system of the gods, the system of the gods of Greek mythology is understood as the real correlates of the system of philosophical ideas. So so Schelling has the idea that the different gods within the pantheon of the Greek gods represent or embody different powers of nature, which we could also conceptualize in philosophical terms. So there's a kind of system of the gods which correlates to the system of philosophical ideas, and he says that mythology regenerates nature within the sphere of art. So mythology sort of repeats nature by representing the powers of nature in the form of these different divine beings. This is an idea which will remain constant in Schelling's thinking all the way through to his late philosophy. He always has this idea of a mythological system which expresses the powers of nature. And the gods of Greek mythology are one of the main objects for Greek sculpture. So sculpture is the culminating or definitive kind of formative art, since it's the concrete embodiment of a god envisaged in human form. It's the embodiment of an idea, of an embodiment of the divine. So the point that Shelling is making there is that in a work of art, the form and the content have to be integrated. The form and the content have to coincide. So the content also has to be a unity of form and content, and this means a unity of the ideal and the real, and a unity of the finite and the infinite. So the image of the Greek god is already a unity of the finite and the infinite, because it's a divine being represented in a human form, and that this content is then again embodied in the form of the sculpture. So the mythology is the material for the works of art. It's the basic material or the basic content for the works of art. But of course, there's a fundamental difference between the ancient Greek world and the modern world. So in the ancient Greek world, the gods are in nature. In the Homeric epics, for example, the agency of the gods and the humans is intertwined. As you know, if you've read the Iliad or the Odyssey, the gods are constantly intervening in the actions of the human beings. There's nothing miraculous about this intervention of the gods, because it's regarded as just part of the process of the world. There's nothing astonishing or miraculous about it. But in the modern Christian world, the divine is ideal. In other words, the divine is infinite, or it's an infinity which is beyond nature. So this is a very different way of thinking about the divine from the way the divine is represented in Greek mythology. So this is a point which will also be very central to Hegel's thinking about the history of art. So this raises the question: if mythology provides the content for art, how can there be a modern mythology? If art is a way of embodying mythology, what would the equivalent be in the modern world? So we don't have a mythology like the ancient Greek mythology. So Shelling says that modern poets have to create their own mythology. A modern poet has to create her own mythology or his own mythology, because we no longer have a mythology like the mythology of the ancient Greeks. But this is a problematic idea, because a mythology seems to be a collective product. It's something we could say that arises or emerges unconsciously out of a people or a culture, or it's a reflection of a people or a culture, or an expression of a people or a culture. But a mythology is something collective. It's not something which an individual can invent or create. So in this sense, the idea that a poet can create their own mythology seems to be a problematic idea. I think, did someone ask a question? Okay. someone has a question about the Greek tragedy. So is the theatre play a formal art or a verbal art? Yeah, that's a good question. I think a play performed in the theatre it's both, isn't it? So Shelling categorizes it as a verbal art, but it is also enacted in the theatre. So it's something you can actually see, you can actually observe. So I think we would have to say that it's the final verbal art, but in a way it is also it's the integration of all the arts. It's the integration of all the arts. It's the integration of the formative arts and the verbal arts. But I think that Shelling has difficulty explaining that point within his system, because he has a double division, but he also has triple division. Yeah. So within formative art, he has 3 kinds of art. Within verbal art, he has 3 kinds of art. But then he only has a double division between formative and verbal. And it looks as though he needs a 3rd kind of art which unites formative and verbal. So that's a good point. I think there's a problem with the way that he constructs his system, and that it would be quite a good idea to suggest that a play in the theatre is like the unity of the formative and the verbal art. I think that's an interesting idea. So when we think about Greek tragedy, we can't think of it in terms of ideal. Yeah. I don't think, this is Fernanda asking a question, I don't think it's only ideal in the sense that it uses language to express ideas. It's not pre-metaphysical, because for Shelling, all art is metaphysical. All art is an expression of a metaphysical conception. So I didn't actually talk more specifically about his theory of drama and his theory of tragedy, but in his theory of tragedy, he thinks that you have the unity of freedom and necessity. So this goes back to the other question that we were discussing earlier on today, the problem of the relation between freedom and necessity. So in the Greek tragedy, in the ancient Greek tragedy, you have individuals who find themselves dominated by necessity. So an obvious example is Oedipus in Oedipus Rex, because he kills his father and he marries his mother, but he does not know that that is what he's doing. It is fate which forces him to do these things, for which, in a way, he is not responsible. But then Oedipus accepts the responsibility for what he has done. So he freely accepts necessity. And Shelling thinks that this is the achievement of the Greek drama, that it shows us how we can reconcile freedom and necessity through the form of the work of art. So the question of could there be a modern mythology is very important, as we will see tomorrow, because Hegel has concerns about whether art can continue in the modern world. That might seem a very surprising thing to say, but Hegel has a thesis or a theory of what is called the end of art. This question of the end of art is connected with the question of modern mythology, or the possibility of a modern mythology, and the nature of the modern world. So this is a question that we will be discussing again tomorrow when we talk about Hegel's theory of the end of art. But just to conclude, I wanted to refer to another text in which this question emerges. So this is a text which some of you may know. It's called The Oldest System Program of German Idealism. It's a very short text. It's only 2 pages. And it was written in around 1796, 1797. The strange thing about this text is that the handwriting is Hegel's handwriting. So it's written by Hegel, but many commentators think that the ideas belong to Shelling, or maybe the ideas even belong to another friend, the poet Hölderlin, who Hegel and Shelling and Hölderlin were all at school together. So they were friends from the time that they were in school. So this text seems to be a combination of ideas from the 3 of them. And they talk about mythology at the end of this text. Excuse me. So the end of the text says, here first I shall speak of an idea which, as far as I know, has never before entered anyone's mind. We must have a new mythology. This mythology, however, must stand in the service of the ideas. It must become a mythology of reason. Until we render the ideas aesthetic, i.e. mythological, they are of no interest to the people. And conversely, until mythology is rational, the philosopher must be ashamed of it. Thus the enlightened and the unenlightened must in the end join hands. Mythology must become philosophical and the people rational, and philosophy must become mythological in order to make philosophers sensuous. Then eternal unity reigns amongst us. No longer shall any force be suppressed. Then universal freedom and equality of spirits will reign. A higher spirit sent from heaven must found this new religion among us. It will be the last, the greatest work of humankind. So this is a kind of utopian idea which is expressed in this text, which comes from the beginning, the very beginning of German idealism. And the question or the problem is that philosophy might have a rational conception of how the world should be renewed, how the world should be transformed, but philosophy is something abstract. Philosophy operates with concepts. So in order to have a vision of reality or of a new reality which inspires people, it needs to take the form of a mythology. It needs to be something concrete and pictorial, and based on images, and something sensuous that you can experience rather than just abstract concepts. So this is what they're trying to think about here. How can mythology become rational, and how can philosophical reason become mythological? So you can see that we have the problem of the relation between the concrete and the abstract, between the conceptual and the sensory, re-emerges here in the form of a kind of political program, or a program for the transformation of society, which they call it a new religion, but it would be the work of humankind. So this is interesting, because we normally think of religion as something divine or supernatural, but they also say here that this religion would be the work of humankind. So it would be something made by human beings. So this is very much a problem with which the German idealists are dealing. How to make philosophy or philosophical insights or metaphysical insights concrete. And that's, of course, where art plays this very important role, and the mythology which art is based on, because it makes philosophical insight, or it makes rational concepts concrete and something that can be experienced. So in his lecture in the System of Transcendental Idealism, and in the lectures on the philosophy of art, Shelling is still attached. He's still attached to this conception of a new mythology. He says, therefore, it can be expected that philosophy, as it was born and raised by poetry, and with it all those sciences it leads towards perfection, will after their perfection flow back like individual rivers into the extensive ocean of poetry from where they originated. It is not hard to say what will be the mediator for the return of science to poetry, since such mediator existed as mythology before this division that now seems unbridgeable had occurred. Yet how a new mythology could come into existence, not as the invention of one single poet, but of a new generation living as one poet, is a problem to which the solution can be expected from the future fate of the world and the consequent course of history. So there he's saying, this is at the end of the System of Transcendental Idealism, when he's talking about art. We need a new mythology, because philosophy is abstract. Philosophy cannot inspire and motivate people. It needs to be translated back into poetry. But to do that, we need a new mythology, and he anticipates a new mythology. And he says something similar in the philosophy of art. He says every truly creative individual must himself create his own mythology. This mythology, however, will quite definitely be created and is not allowed to be designed simply according to the instructions of certain ideas of philosophy, since in the latter case it would likely be impossible to give it independent poetic life. Thus, until history returns mythology to us as a universally valid form, the situation will be that the individual will have to create his own poetic circle for himself. So, Shelling is anticipating the idea of the possibility of a new mythology. So, as we'll see tomorrow, this is an idea which Hegel abandons. So he might have Hegel wrote down the transcript of the system program of German idealism, but later in his life, in his mature philosophy, how can I put this? Hegel is much more, not necessarily pessimistic, but realistic about the nature of the modern world. And he thinks that this notion that there could be a new mythology which would unite people and inspire people and make possible the creation of art is just completely unrealistic. It's not compatible with the structure of the modern world. And this raises the question of what the future of art will be. If we abandon the notion of a new mythology, what will the future of art be? So this is one of the principal questions which we will discuss tomorrow with Hegel. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes left for questions, if anyone has questions. So Beatrice asked, what does he mean by mythology? Is it like inspiration? So let me think how to express this. So Shelling thinks that in the ancient world, in the world of the ancient Greeks, there was everyone lived in this kind of mythological world. How can I put this? The gods are not just ideas in people's heads. The gods are in nature. The gods are how you experience the world. Yeah. So that means that there is already divinity in nature. Nature and divinity are united in this way of experiencing, in this mythological way of experiencing. Yeah. So why is that important? Well, because if you think that in a work of art there must be a unity of form and content, you can only have a unity of form and content if the content is itself already a unity of form and content. And similarly, if the form is already a unity of form and content. I'll try and explain that in more detail tomorrow. But you see, if there was just a clear distinction or a clear opposition between form and content, they could not be united. So that means the content must already be a unity of opposites, and the form must already be a unity of opposites. And then if the content is a unity of opposites and the form is a unity of opposites, then the content and the form can themselves unite. That's the basic idea. So if you live in a mythological world, as I said a moment ago, you already have that unity of the finite and the infinite, of the natural and the divine in the way you experience the world. So that can then be expressed or manifested through the form of the work of art. So that's what the mythology is. The mythology is giving you the material for art in which you already have a unity of opposites. You already have a unity of the natural and the divine, or the real and the ideal. Yeah. I hope that makes it clearer. No problem with the English. So if you ask, well, is it like inspiration? Well, it's kind of like inspiration because it's what gives the it's what gives the poets, and it's what gives the artists and the sculptors. It gives them their material. It gives them what they write about, and it gives them what they represent in their sculptures. Yeah, it gives them the raw material. Yeah. So the problem, just to anticipate what we will discuss tomorrow, or one of the things we will discuss tomorrow, the problem with the modern world is that it no longer has that unity. So Hegel talks about the prose of the world. You know, there's an opposition between poetry and prose, and we could say that the mythological world is already a poetic world. Hegel says that the modern world is a world of prose, not of poetry. What he means is that it's a world which is dominated by rules and regulations and abstract principles. And in that kind of world, what is the material for art? That's the problem. That's the question that he's posing. Yeah. So so someone has asked a question. This idea of multiple mythologies for multiple individuals actually proves itself since the contemporary art exists, and how that idea expands its horizons when we think about the democracy and actuality caused by multiple groups of society. Yeah, yeah. So it's we could say that some modern artists have tried to create their own mythology. In order to create the material for their poetry, but as you said in your question, then we have lots of different mythologies. Everybody has their own mythology, or everybody has their own sort of view. Yeah. And it's no longer the expression of a community. So that that political purpose of uniting people disappears anyway. We no longer have that political purpose. Okay, so somebody's asking, it looks like this Phil Hellenist way of thinking art falls into an, looks really close to life theories, yeah. So yeah, that's very interesting, the Phil Hellenist question. So these philosophers were living in a time when ancient Greece was a kind of ideal. There is no doubt about that. So ancient Greece is a kind of model for them. And we will see that in, again, we will see that in Hegel's Aesthetics tomorrow, that Hegel thinks that in one way, classical art, and in particular classical sculpture, was the definitive form of art, or the supreme form of art. But that doesn't mean that he also knows that that could not continue, that it had to disappear, and that the modern world had to replace the classical world. So he's not looking back to the classical world as though we could actually return to the classical world. So that is one of the problems with the idea of a new mythology. You could say that the idea of a new mythology seems to assume that we could go back to a kind of a much more less pluralistic society, a less individualistic society of the kind which existed in ancient Greece, where the community was very powerful over the individuals. So again, there is this question about Phil Hellenism and the relation between ancient Greece as an ideal and the modern world, and what it means to accept the modern world, and what the possibilities of art might be in the modern world. So again, these are all questions which we will see Hegel exploring in his philosophy of art. I think there was one more question. Oh yeah, why did Shelling place music at the real side of formative art? In European art music, the main object of music is abstraction, and the musical performance could be regarded merely only realization of this abstraction, similar to reading a poem out loud. Could you explain this point again? Yeah. Thank you very much. That's a really interesting point. So so again, as we'll see tomorrow, one of the big differences between Schelling and Hegel is that Schelling puts music right at the beginning, on the real side of the formative art. So in a way, it's the most real kind of art for Schelling, whereas Hegel puts music between painting and poetry. So Hegel has a narrative of idealization. The forms of art, the kinds of art are becoming more and more ideal, less and less material. So we can see that with painting, because painting is representing material objects on a two-dimensional surface. And then music is even more ideal, because it doesn't even represent anything at all. It's just a pure expression of feeling. It's a pure expression of subjectivity, without any representation of the material world. So and therefore Hegel puts it after painting and on the way to poetry, which is the most abstract. He thinks poetry is the most abstract or the most ideal. So there are problems with both classifications. there's a problem with Hegel's classification, as we'll see tomorrow, because he thinks that that music is too abstract. Hegel thinks that music doesn't have sufficient content because it's just an expression of subjectivity. So music is a real difficult problem for Hegel because of where he places it in his sequence. So Shelling is interesting because he puts music right at the beginning. Well, why does he do that? Well, it's because, as I tried to explain, you make music by striking objects. You know, you have to hit the drum, or you have to blow into the saxophone, or you have to scrape the string on the violin. You have to affect the physical object to make this vibration come out of it. So that's a very physical process. It's a very material process. You might not think of sound as material, but sound is very material. Sound is material because you make it by hitting things, or striking things, or bowing things, or blowing into things. Yeah, and also the basic dimension of music is rhythm, which is repetition. It's a repetition of a certain unity. So this is the most, Shelling thinks this is the most basic process of art, is imposing a rhythmic repetition on reality. That's the most basic way in which you can structure reality, is by the use of rhythm. Musical. So he thinks that rhythm is the most fundamental element of music, and then you have harmony and melody, but rhythm is the basic thing. So that's why he puts music at the beginning. But these classifications are very interesting. These attempts to make a system of art where you classify the different arts and you think about the relation between them. But I think these systems, they both have problems. Schelling's system has problems, but Hegel's system, as we will see tomorrow, also has problems. But it's a very interesting, very ambitious attempt to explain how the different arts relate to each other and how we can categorize the different arts. Yeah. Okay, so I think that's all we have time for today. So thank you very much for your attention, your patience, listening to my English for 2.5 hours. I will ask Vivian to send the PowerPoints again for you, and tomorrow we'll talk about Hegel's aesthetics. Okay, thanks very much. Thank you.
Obrigada, professor.